that we get to around the midpoint of the interview. All right. We're recording now, so I will get started here. Hey everyone, Anthony Fantano here, Internet's busiest music nerd. Thank you very much for watching this interview on YouTube, where first we streamed it, did it live on Twitch. Make sure to check out our Twitch page, which is linked down below. We're doing new Music Friday streams and interviews all the time. What we're doing now is what I hope is going to be an amazing conversation with jazz musician, composer, conceptual artist, Miss Matana Roberts. Her record Coin Coin that dropped a little while back was one of my favorites of that year, and I've just been dying to pick her brain about that and a lot of other things too. She comes to us from overseas at the moment, and I'm just really excited to talk to you. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Oh, I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation.
Well, I appreciate you coming through. I know that this latest record that you've just put out with Pat Thomas, The Truth, that dropped last year. Do you want to go a little bit into what sort of made that collaboration come together?
Well, that's just that's not a record that. Well, first I should say Pat Thomas is The Truth. I'll say that. But that was not a project that was my idea, nor was it Pat Thomas's. It was Cafe Otto in London recorded a live show that we did for their archive. And it was a show that I agreed to do because I was very curious about Pat, because I'd seen him live a few times. I played a set with him in Tokyo the year before that, and I was like, wow, I want to see what it would be like to play in a duo situation with him. And so that gig just happened to be recorded, and Cafe Otto liked it so much. They approached us about wanting to put it out. It's not really an ongoing project of any kind, but I'm glad that it exists as a document, and I think Pat Thomas is one of the most underrated musicians of this time period, in my opinion. And I hope that record turns more people on to his work, and also just the great releases that continue to come off that label.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really a rousing, free improvisational performance, and I didn't mean to imply that what you had done there was like a project in the same way that like the Coin Coin series is, or anything like that. I just merely meant like from a record type perspective. But outside of seeing his performances, was there an earlier introduction to his music previous to that point?
No, but I'd always heard about him. He was kind of one of those musicians, traveling around that you'd always hear about, but I'd never seen. And I'd heard on a couple of other collaborative recordings that he'd been a part of. And he'd always kind of been on my list of people to seek out. I'm constantly trying to find other people to play music with, partly to also bring them into kind of the Coin Coin stratosphere. That was partly that also. But he's a very interesting fellow with a really interesting history, and he'll talk your ear off. He's a very loquacious, knowledgeable, just human all the way around.
Given his background and your background as a Chicago musician yourself, do you have any like deeper thoughts and observations about the UK jazz scene, especially as of right now, where it seems to be kind of popping off a little bit, especially with like all of these bands and projects connected to Shabaka Hutchings, which seem to be so well received at the moment?
Yeah, Shabaka is a force. So I say that first. But I also say like my interest is kind of in a hybrid, in these sort of cracks of different genres. So I'm never kind of I'm actually not always paying a lot of attention to jazz music, even though my music gets put there and I don't mind it because that is the root from where I come from. But I feel like I'm in other places. What I will say, though, what is coming out of the UK is very, very special. And it's a whole new approach to language in that genre that I've never heard before. And Shabaka is one of the people who really is pushing that, especially on the saxophone. And there are, other genres coming out of the UK that are always really sort of fascinating. I mean, it's a different history, and it's an interesting, as far as Pat Thomas and I are concerned, in terms of like African diasporic sort of mix. It's completely different conversations that I've had with Black British musicians versus conversations that I've had with American Black musicians. Because even though our histories crossed, obviously, because of the slave trade, its manifestation sits in these places very differently. And I had some really interesting conversations with so many musicians coming out of London specifically around those ideals. But Britain was the blueprint for us, right? So it's just really interesting to think about this constant transference. And also, this, I wouldn't call it competitive, but this remembrance of history. The last time the Capitol was stormed, it was stormed by the British in 1812, where they tried to burn it down. Do you understand? So it's just interesting to think about those connections.
No, it is. And I think often they're connections that we're not having enough conversations about, especially since, like, once you make those connections, the grander view of imperialism kind of comes into play. And, the myth of American exceptionalism and uniqueness kind of falls to the wayside, and kind of the overall patterns and cycles continuing from that era become clearer and clearer, and, just are sort of laid bare that we're not necessarily sort of like this one in a million type of thing. We're merely just like kind of continuing a narrative.
Yeah, I mean, Americanness is, I have a lot of pride in being American, only because the stories that I come from, they continually lift me and have lifted me all my life, right? But there's a certain sort of nuance to Americanness and aggressiveness to Americanness that is highly annoying in these other places, It really, really is. And I've been traveling now for almost 20 years. And so I've had to learn in certain places and certain spaces to mute myself a little bit. But the conversations that I've had with musicians in other places about Americanness and American music and a certain love of American music, what sits at the belly of the jazz I heard in Britain, for instance, is American music. Like it's like there's an American aesthetic, but there's a whole other flavor that has nothing to do with America or American history at all. And I think for those musicians you mentioned, you can hear it, and it's so thrilling to witness it.
Being overseas for as long as you have at this point, and watching everything that's going on politically here at the moment, does it make you miss this place at all at the moment? Does it make you happy that you're on a bit of a break in a way, or?
Well, I've always been a bouncer. I bounce all over the place. So I've never been, it's nice to hear people say that I'm from Chicago, but I haven't lived in Chicago since, I think, like 1998, 1999. And New York is where I feel a certain root there it's the one city that I feel like myself in ways that I don't feel anywhere else. So I've always kind of done like this kind of bounce around. But right now, I've been doing a fair amount of bouncing around even in this last year. I'm not, separated from my birth country, really. I'm not one of those people who can say that, oh, I'm an expat watching from, because I'm not, it's, but I'll tell you, the privileges of my American passport, I've never leaned on it so hard as I'm leaning on it right now. This last year, as it's been hard for everyone, but I can say it's been one of the most frightening years of my life, creatively, artistically, emotionally, personally, everything. It's just been like a massive of all this stuff. And watching America from a distance, some of these months, turn into some bastion, some fascist bastion, has made it hard for me to make the work I make some days.
Well, that's actually one of the things I wanted to ask about directly, because your music, even in reference to this new live recording, and again, just the Coin series in general, deals so deeply in history, in the past, in truth. And right now, what is it sort of like to be sort of knee deep in this series during a point historically where it seems like the truth doesn't really matter at all, and it's almost impossible to find uniform agreement on much of anything,
Yeah, one of the most annoying things about it, I realized the other day, is that there's probably going to be a chapter 13, or at least
right. That was another thing I was wondering. You sort of had like it intended upon a certain number of chapters in the series, and I'm like, is this getting longer now?
It's just a touch longer, because a lot of the things that are happening in real time, I process in my visual art and the sound art things and installation. And I have a couple different exhibitions, 3 different exhibitions coming up this year, actually, of visual work that also sits as scores or sits as music. And in those pieces, I'm processing more current events than I am in the coin work, where I'm trying to dig back in order to move forward. American history is so many different layers of quote unquote truths, so many different narratives that don't get told versus the ones that do get told, which is basically, what we're sitting on as a country. The Constitution, is based on a very particular history that left a lot of people out. And we're seeing how that is continuing to translate in the current events. Today in the New York Times, I was reading about the speed at which certain Native American communities are really suffering with the virus. And that is a repeat of a history that they've already been through on stolen land. So there's a lot to dig into. I'm just trying to do my best to keep my head up about it, because I feel a great deal of shame also, just from the last 4 years of this particular administration of he who shall not be named. We will not name him, okay? But on the one hand, I can say, sitting in America, I can say, well, he is the least un-American president that we've ever had. But as a traveler and having a better understanding of the stamp of American imperialism and foreign policy, he may actually be one of the most American presidents that we've ever had in terms of oppressiveness. That's more front and center than it was in the good days of the shroud of Obama, who I loved Obama, but Obama was also a problematic leader, especially around immigration policies. I mean, there's a lot to pull back, but there was something about traveling during the Obama administration, for instance, that was very different when traveling during the Bush administration. I remember traveling during the Bush years and having to play shows and people coming up to me and saying, you should be ashamed to be an American. And at the time saying, well, yeah, I absolutely agree with you, which also is a hurtful thing for me to even utter, really. But what are you going to do? And then traveling during the Obama years where, even just going through airport security officers would fist pump you, they knew you were American. Oh, you're American. Oh, and you play American jazz or you play American music. So there's this whole other thing. But with the Trump, there are only certain countries where I feel like I didn't have to explain, like Britain, for instance, didn't really have to explain how Trump could happen because look at what they're going through right now. But other places, I don't like being speechless, but I was always quite speechless. And at times finding myself in places where I could be silent because the moment my accent is heard, it's very clear where I'm from. And there were moments where, on some days I might not want to speak about it and people ask me where I'm from. And instead of saying I'm American, I would say I was Canadian, that's a problem in itself.
But also, I don't know, incredibly understandable. And yeah, I mean, being politically active myself during the Bush years, I remember like a lot of that shame and embarrassment during that time and just sort of like the general, I guess, like international disdain for much of what happened. But it was, I guess, sort of surprising to see, as you pointed out, there were a lot of problems with the Obama administration, one of which I think was kind of reminded to me just yesterday as charges formally came out for some of those who were in the administration during the Flint water crisis, for allowing that to get as bad as it did. And the way that he came in and just like, popped the glass of water and was like, okay, it's all right now. It's all good. Again, it just sort of served as a reminder of like, as long as you're putting like a friendly face on a lot of this stuff and somebody who, seems approachable and kind and thoughtful and is at least like portraying a baseline level of empathy, like people will kind of, get on board for a lot of stuff. It seems like in the wake of Trump losing, there are a lot of those who are in more of a liberal camp who haven't come to the realization that there's still so much work to do. And they've kind of like, oh, it's problems over. It's all done. Meanwhile, in these very same circles, there's a lot of, I guess, a disrespect and disdain for those who are actually kind of fighting the fight, whether that be in progressive circles or in Black Lives Matter circles. I was reminded of something that I had heard recently in a podcast because you had brought up the New York Times and sort of, that article that you had said they had written about Native Americans suffering from the virus. And, I was just thinking of this constant cycle that we're in between just battling far-right racism, but then just like establishment liberal tut-tutting. That just sort of like is just like wait longer, don't worry about it. Don't do this, do that. Don't be too angry. Don't be too radical because citations needed. I don't know if you listen to that series, but they did this great episode on, the Biden administration's reaction to a lot of the Black Lives Matter sloganeering over the course of this past year. And they brought up this old editorial written in the 1800s in response to slave abolitionists, where they had directly made the argument, clear quotation, the best thing that we could do for slavery at this point, the North could do to abolish it, is to stop talking to the South about it, stop being so loud about it, stop bringing it up, stop complaining so much about it,
right.
And we'll get closer to abolition than you think. We'll get there faster than you think. And it seems like that same narrative is being trotted out in a way all over again, because, it seems like the people who are protesting, the people who are making noise, the people who are pointing out this, violent police brutality, like, look, the more you complain, the more you point it out, even with this recent Capitol storming, the more that you try to hold these people account, the more violent they're going to get, the more mad they're going to get, the more unhappy you're going to be because they're going to retaliate. When it seems like, when we actually look at history and all this stuff plays out, isn't it the lack of action that continues to make this stuff worse? Isn't the lack of action what continues to make this stuff persist?
Well, it's also the lack of awareness. You know, Black folks have been talking about this for
sure.
centuries. You know, this is nothing about the storming of the Capitol. I can guarantee you, I would bet my life on it. There's not a single African American person who watched the footage of that and said, "Wow, that's so wow." You know, how could these people? No, we remember because we know the history. Some of us, not obviously not all of us, judging by a couple of the people that I noted that were also there that really shouldn't have been there. It's like like I don't want to be careful with my words, but I also just I'm trying to work it out myself because the images that I've seen from the last few days, shocking, not shocking, you know, like, oh yeah, watching those white men scaling the wall of the Capitol, I couldn't stop thinking about that, thinking about, can you imagine if it was Black Lives Matter protesters or just people of color all the way around and noticing, you know, the way the Capitol was protected during Black Lives Matter protests that was near. There'd be dead bodies all the way around the Capitol. There would be, it just wouldn't have happened in quite that way. I'm just not certain, you know, what the real answer is there for, you know, is it more awareness that's needed? Or is it, you know, is it the fact that the United States of America is built upon, is rooted in structural racism, is rooted in a very tradition of anti-Blackness that spreads not only to quote unquote white individuals, but also spreads to people of color as well. Also, if you notice some of the people that were at that, I always feel sorry for those folks because it's like, wow, they never really got the memo. But at the same time, it shows the toxicity of a certain kind of white supremacist rhetoric and how violent it is. Even in its, you know, its silence as it was being passed around on certain social media apps and blah, 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 blah. It's created something that has really always been in the country. It never left. That's so these people talking about, oh, you know, this is so surprising. It's always
yeah. I mean, when you're talking about the types of people who showed up at the Capitol that day to do what they did, you know, you're talking about a lot of individuals who are connected to far right and militia groups who have been around since the Obama era and before. And when you look back at the history, and you know, it's sort of strange and disappointing that it wasn't sort of like properly contextualized in the media throughout 2016. But when you look at, you know, I think really kind of the furthest back, or kind of the most anybody ever dug into this, was to point to Trump and ask him, like, you know, birtherism, wasn't that racist? You know, wasn't birtherism bad? Wasn't that wrong? But the thing is, like, there was never really a conversation about like who birtherism appealed to. And that base of individuals, he's still courting them to this point. Those people have been in his camp all along, and he dragged them to that moment in history where he came down the escalator and said what he said when he, you know, announced his run for presidency. So, you know, it should have been no surprise that those were the individuals that he was courting all along. Those were the types of individuals that showed up at the Capitol that day to do what they did. And, yeah, you know, and that's why, you know, I think a lot of people are like, surprised, unfortunately, because those exact groups aren't like brought into context enough. They're not discussed enough, and the way all of that's tied into the QAnon stuff is also not really discussed enough. I feel like in the mainstream media, the extent to which that's talked about is, these people are crazy, they're conspiracy theorists, and so on and so forth. But it's not brought up enough that there are individuals who have done, murderous, violent actions on behalf of this conspiracy theory. That these online communities are very well connected, and there are different, communities, sub-communities on the internet, like the health and wellness community and, the yoga community, that for some reason they seem to be seeping into. Even elements of, black social media spaces too. When Overstock was trending on Twitter months ago, I remember there were a lot of people on Black Twitter trending that because there was this theory that, like, look at these giant metal cabinets, they're selling for $20,000, and the name of the cabinet is Teresa. It's like there must be a person in that cabinet, and then when you buy it, a person comes in the cabinet. But the thing is, like, it was QAnon that had sort of planted the seed of that. And then it sort of just spread unknowingly onto the internet to, another part. And the thing is that there's not enough people sort of connecting all of these dots. And, what I think is so essential about the work that you do through the Coin series and beyond is that, you're doing a lot of in-depth research and storytelling into, these violent pasts and, histories. And I mean, while I am amazed by it, and while I love what you do, simultaneously, I have to come away from it blown away and also scratching my head thinking, like, but why is she doing this? Like, the work that you're doing here, it doesn't necessarily need to be embodied in a music project, but, kind of the in-depth sort of research that you're doing should be being done by some kind of well-paid government agency that's like, gathering all of this information and then disseminating it to people so they can understand, like, why is this sort of work thrown upon you? Why is this work thrown upon, like, a news corporation like the New York Times for the 1619 Project? Shouldn't this be sort of like a public work sort of thing where everyone can collectively come together and gain from this? Because looking at the histories of other countries that have kind of, survived a fascist era and have successfully kind of progressed beyond that, there was a point of re-education that was necessary in order to, like, unbrainwash people from the lies that they had been told about, their history, those who were out to get them, the paranoia, the violence, the so on and so forth. And I feel like America is kind of in need of a similar thing. And in its own way, I think your music does kind of provide that experience.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I feel like a lot of the things that are happening have a lot to do also with the violence of the algorithm. And how, these conspiracy theories have been passed around. I mean, I am a super health conscious person, not for any sort of like mainstream sort of thing, but as a political act, because I was raised in an environment in Chicago where we were taught that Western medicine was out to kill Black people, that the hospital that I was born in, the joke was, if you made it out alive, that was, something quite honorable, right? And so I've also been kind of watching this sort of QAnon thing affect these sort of health junkets, and it's been really disturbing. But it's also been a reminder that the basis that the health industry, for instance, sits on is a very white supremacist history that it comes from. That this health and wellness was about, holding on to the master race. It was about eugenics. It wasn't about, everybody has a right to feel this way. No, we need to get strong and stay healthy, to fight this scourge of otherness coming into the arena. So I'm almost not surprised what's going on there. But as far as myself, like, I come from a lineage of people who were deeply involved in grassroots social justice networks and education and community reliance. And I probably chose to make this work as a kind of my contribution to that, because otherwise being an art making person for me would feel a bit dilettantish, would feel, what's the point? Why, I'm an able-bodied person, and able-bodied people, one of the things that should root us is service and being parts of communities that need service and need help, and need lift and need inspiration. But these histories are the histories that have really driven me throughout my life. So it's a combination of all those things. I don't know. That's not a really good answer to your question, but it's a bit all.
I mean, it's there's a lot to take into account, and I think going into it, I was a little all over the place too. But but to get a little bit more pointed and looking to the future now with Coin Chapter 4 being finished, right now, where is your work putting you for the fifth installment in terms of like stories or narratives that you might be diving into, or even some of the, I guess, more sonic adventures you might be going on as well, since, the last chapter, I think was one of the more instrumentally ambitious that you've pulled together so far.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that was such a fun record to make. And I really look forward to playing it live for people. I guess I feel like I'm in a weird sort of inertia space of where I'm constantly working on the project. The chapters have been mapped out for quite a while now. And so going back and forth into them, trying to see what works and what doesn't. It was important for me for the first 4 chapters, to place locations in a very specific way. And now in the ensuing chapters, it's going to be more about, even more about a sort of individual stories in a different way than the other chapters. I mean, the next chapters coming are really ambitious, and funding is always a issue for me, which is why it's been kind of slower than I would like to in terms of getting the records out. But the next series of records are much larger ensembles. And so I'm chasing around trying to pull that all together while still doing a lot of research that I can and can't do because I'm used to being an experiential traveler for research of the work, right? Like going to Africa, like going to see the slave castles on the Ivory Coast and things of that nature. Getting on a cargo ship and trying to get a feeling for what migration is like. Doing in-person interviews, field recordings, this whole thing. So I'm kind of moving around trying to figure out the next steps for that while working through this whole COVID period. And I feel like everything is still a bit in limbo. So I work on that, but then also during this period, I've been really grateful to be asked to write music for other people. So there's all sorts of things and then visual stuff that I'm always doing that's a bit of a combination of all those things where I can kind of deal with the limbo that's going on right now. But I would say the next series and the next records in the Concon series are quite ambitious, more ambitious even than the last.
What you had just said made me want to ask you quickly, would you be willing to talk about some of the music that you've been writing for other artists at this point? I mean, are you crossing over into any kind of new territories or anything in regards to that?
Oddly, I'm crossing over into podcast territory where people are asking me to write theme music. One project that I don't think I'm allowed to announce yet, but is really interesting, based around the life of a very well-known jazz musician that I'm finishing right now, actually. And I have a foot in the new music classical world. So, for instance, I had my first string quartet was recorded by Brooklyn Riders String Quartet, and it came out last year. It's nominated for a Grammy, their record, which is interesting. And I'm being asked to write solo pieces for solo instruments and kind of the new music classical world, which is a different world for me. And I have an orchestra piece that I'm working on that was supposed to premiere this year. It's been pushed to 2022. And then I have collaborative things with different organizations, for instance, in the US, like the Music Box organization in New Orleans, for instance. I'm doing a collaboration with them, building one of their music box houses. That's on hold for the moment. But things of that nature. And then I'm trying to I have a huge archive of sound stuff that's never been heard, field recordings and things, but also some pieces that have never been heard. And I'm trying to figure out what I want to do with them. And I did that piece for Adult Swim, just like these little things that are coming that are keeping me afloat. I'm really grateful.
The Adult Swim thing had just come out, or it's yet to come out? I haven't caught that or caught wind of that.
It came out maybe November. Okay. In November. It was a mix of different musicians that they commissioned to write a piece. That was really fun to do.
You know, in the spirit of that, we have a user question from Slid V saying, "How much do you charge for a feature?" Or I guess if you don't want to get too monetary about it, I mean, what's your general attitude as well toward approaches when it comes to features? You know, would you hop on a track, do some poetry? Would you hop on a track, do some saxophone, that sort of thing for maybe sort of like a more commercial artist, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I'm often asked to add saxophone to things. I still work as a side woman. I never really talk about that much, but I'm glad that people still ask me to do that because I do love playing the saxophone. It's all the music, everything I write, everything I make, the visual stuff comes from my root in with the alto saxophone. So I look at everything on a case-by-case basis, and it's more about, do I like the music? Do I like what I'm being asked to do? And I feel really lucky. There was a time in my life where I had to say yes to everything. Like, just, say yes. I'll try anything once, as a sense of survival. And now I'm at a stage where I'm able to pick and choose a little bit. And I'm really grateful for that. So I'm not going to say like a number on this interview, but that I'm always
what would be the most efficient way of reaching out to you for such a thing?
Via my website.
Yeah, which is literally we're on a screen right now where people can see your website right below you. So,
okay. That's
this person, Diego Smooth, is asking, how are you so goddamn talented? I don't know if you want to just answer that as bluntly as you can, but maybe also get into a bit of maybe some of those more formative years of becoming a musician, yourself, and kind of explaining that progress to this point.
I mean, it's a struggle. I still cannot play the saxophone the way that I want to. And I've been playing the saxophone for like 25 years now, almost. Yeah. And I've been playing instruments since I was 7 or 8 years old. I was one of those people that really benefited from free music lessons in the public school system that were still available at that time. And I really struggled actually in school. I have a learning disorder, but was never like officially diagnosed until only a few years ago. And I really struggled in school, but it was this music lesson that I would have every week. And I loved this music lesson because it would get me out of these remedial classes that I was being put in, that I don't even think I belonged in those classes. And my parents didn't think I belonged there either. And that's a whole other discussion about structural racism as it pertains to little brown children. But I really thrived. Clarinet was my first instrument, and I loved that instrument. And I still do play it, but I loved the sound of that instrument. And then it was just from there, also being involved in some like formative Black arts movement programs through my parents. You know, I was in an all Black children's chorus, theater groups and things like that. And then I just kept playing, and I kept having opportunities to play. And then my formative years in Chicago, I mean, that really set the pace of like a certain elder mentorship. The elder mentorship that I received, I'm still feeding off that mentorship today from people like Fred Anderson, the saxophonist Vaughn Freeman, some of my contemporaries that were running around at that time, like Josh Abrams, Nicole Mitchell, Tamika Reed, Chad Taylor. I really got to be a part of a community in a way that really helped me to develop something that I'm still trying to figure out today. But in terms of, I have friends who I feel, and I'm not putting myself down, I love myself. I love my life despite everything, even in this last year with the virus and whatnot. I live a very charmed life, and it's because of music. But I have friends who I feel are way more talented than I am, and the saxophone is a beast of an instrument. It's not an instrument that you can like, oh, I'm going to play a little today and then put it down for months. That you cannot do that. It beats you into submission, and I still struggle with submitting to it sometimes.
Going off of that conversation, the real Joe 13 wants to get your thoughts generally on improvisation. He would love to hear you talk more about that as a concept and what you look for when you put improvised sections on a record.
I'm on the Coin records in particular. I'm trying to get very particular people on those recordings, people that I have history with in different ways. Because when the series is over, it's almost going to be a sonic autobiography of sorts too, for me, in terms of the people that I keep trying to get involved. And it's one of the reasons I put that project together, was because there were so many people I wanted to play music with. And how could I do it all? Well, I can do it all under this sort of thing. And so with that being said, I look for a certain sort of lived experience that you can hear in the music, you know, because I went to schools and studied, and I have a lot of different opinions about that. I'm grateful to some of those places. I'm not grateful to all of those places. I will say that, because you can't teach lived experience. And I think that thing about the elder mentors that I mentioned, you could hear their lived experience through their horns in a way that you're just not going to get in a program somewhere. It's about a combination of living, and improvisation is something that we all do every day. And there's a certain sort of art to it that I listen for, but also a certain sort of empathy in the musicians that I try to involve in the project, because some of the ideas and some of the things that I put forth, for some musicians, they found it offensive in some other projects that I've done. So I'm really careful. I wish I didn't have to be so careful, but I'm really careful about how I chart that. And I mean, some people will say improvisation, you know, improvisation is improvisation. But for me, the sound of lived experience hits my nervous system, hits my just ability to hear in a different sort of way than hearing someone who's just, you know, messing around.
When you talk about a few seconds ago, being able to or wanting to play the way that you want to, is that a matter for you more of trying to find your own way to adequately project and communicate that lived experience through, you know, your own playing? Or is it, you know, more of just like the instrument being an extension of yourself, that sort of thing, or even something more abstract than both of those things?
I never thought about it like that before, but that's interesting. That might be where some of my dissatisfaction lies, because I don't have the lived experience of a 70-year-old saxophonist, you know? But I mean, one thing I can tell you that I really worked on and that I really focused on, and I'm really proud that I focused on that because it's still at the root of everything, but the sound, like my sound, I spent so much time on not, you know, like, finger technique so much, but just sound, like getting the saxophone to sound in a way that really is an extension of myself. But there's a certain sort of, I think the year, maybe it was like 1996, I was on a stage at the Velvet Lounge in Chicago with Josh Abrams and Chad Taylor. And there was this one moment, it maybe lasted a minute, maybe a minute and a half, where everything stopped. Time stopped, everything. It was like some quantum something feeling. And it was so amazing that I keep trying to get to that moment, some retainment of that moment. And I haven't been able to get to that moment again. So I think some of my dissatisfaction on the saxophone has a lot to do with that. But, you know, Von Freeman said, you don't want to be like what's the word for someone who's like so good? You don't want to be an expert, or you don't want to be, what's the prodigy? You don't want to be a prodigy. You just want to be good, because if you're good, you're always going to have things to work on, and that keeps things interesting. So I keep trying to think like that, but sometimes it's hard.
Is it a, you know, that experience of time stopping, do you feel like that's kind of a universal experience for musicians? I mean, not to get corny with it, but, you know, I mean, I'm a musician myself, but what I'm trying to reference here is the most recent thing was a scene from that fucking Pixar movie Saw where I watched that shit where, you know, they're playing together, and then he kind of drifts off on the piano, and the background drops out, and, you know, it sort of seems like he's in his own world and he's playing entirely by himself. You know, I mean, what you just described there seemed almost like that was like the visual depiction of that very experience, as you know, again, dorky as it is to bring that movie up in this context, but
no, but in the things that I do outside of my music life, like I'm thinking about like I have, how do you say, adrenaline. It's an adrenaline thing. And so I do like sporty stuff that pushes me into kind of that adrenaline zone where you're only able to focus. And almost sort of like a danger zone, like extreme sports stuff, where one of the reasons I like it so much is because I focus. And once you focus, you're kind of in this whole new sort of thing. And as a musician, you know, you've had the times where you're playing and then all of a sudden you're remembering like your grocery list, or like something that you really don't need to be thinking about while you're playing music. But you've also had those moments where you're just so immersed in the sound, nothing else matters. So I'm just trying to figure out how to get back to these certain all points in sound. And that one particular moment on the Velvet Lounge stage, like, I don't even know. Sometimes I think, oh, it's just because one of the things that made it possible is the artistry of Josh and Chad. Like, those are two incredible musicians. And like sitting in the belly of that, it's almost like just being on a magic carpet of like, right, there's so much support there. So then you can just really be free in a different kind of way. But in the Coin Coin records, it's one of the reasons those records are concert length records, for instance, even though there are tracks on them. I want you to listen to the whole thing beginning to end, because I'm trying to get you in that zone. I want to get you in that zone as a listener. And when I perform that work, I want to be in that zone as a performer.
let me see. I'm not sure how to NZA CCA Nini. I'm not sure how to pronounce this name, but this individual wants to know who are some of your favorite non-jazz artists currently that are maybe of the more contemporary set.
I listen to some of everything. Like I kind of run all over the place. I mean, you know, I devoured the new Jasmine Sullivan the other day because I was just curious, like, you know, what is it? Her voice sounds like a horn to me, and that's why I like hearing it. I'm kind of tired of hearing records that are about just a certain sort of binary. And I look for artists and musicians who are trying to keep things as inclusive as they can about sounds, which is really difficult. But I listen, I don't know, I'm trying to think in the last few days, Dean Blunt, Kelsey Lou. I don't know if she's going by Kelsey Lou McJunkin.
I think she just dropped a track with like Eve Toomer on it, which just had it titled as Kelsey Lou. So,
oh yeah, I'm a huge fan. Sarah Davachi, listening to the other day. There's a new Susan Alcorn that I was listening to, and then you know I come from very specific hip hop roots, so there's certain people that I still sort of check out, and I check out the controversy. I listened to the new Azalea Banks recently, who's so problematic, but I think she's incredibly talented. And it's just interesting to listen to. I listen to Beyonce now and then. I've been really getting into Nigerian pop though, and more kind of like Afrobeat music recently, just because it's also keeping my spirit up. I've been listening to a lot of drum music, which is not so contemporary, and then just old stuff, like, you know, I don't know, like old neo soul stuff, old Roots records, old Nas records, and then I'm trying to think. Oh, who's the guy? Toby.
Oh yeah. He's like killing it on Instagram right now. Every Instagram video and post he does just like pops off.
I really like his music, and then just I am always following kind of female MCs, just seeing. I'm really kind of interested still in that history. And I take a lot of inspiration sometimes from some of those folks, and then I worry about some of them also. But I'm all over the place.
All right. One more question, and then I'd like to ask you one myself personally. But Unknown Geek 777 wants to know: are there any grassroots organizations that have personally influenced you, or that you've encountered over the years, whose work you'd like to plug, to support their causes at the moment?
Anything connected to Black Lives Matter, I think is incredibly important. Wherever you are, anything, another thing, organizations that are dealing with water rights, fracking. I'm trying to think of, are there any, anything having to do with the ACLU, anything having to do just with human rights abuses, anything having to do with sex workers' rights and abuses and sex trafficking. There's so many, but I think even within thinking about organizations, there's still so much a single one of us can do on the grassroots level. And I think it's just about any prison abolishment projects I think are really important. Getting rid of these, corporate prison systems, anything having to do with reproductive rights. Like there's so
many fronts this battle is on.
Yeah, there's so many that I don't feel like I could single out any. But I think just anything that is closer to your community that you can be a part of, you do whatever you can to be a part.
All right. Leaving, are there any, other projects or other things that you have coming out around the corner that you want all of us to be aware of, since it's, near in the future or anything like that?
Honestly, at this moment, I'm just trying to stay alive.
Understandable.
I'm just trying to stay alive. And so, and I really believe in kind of this like collective vibration of all of us, like doing our best to do that. I always have things moving. There are always things going on. I don't really have much of a social media presence right now, and that is purposeful, because I find the algorithms racist and full of lots of other isms where I need to survive this period. But my website, I always list things. I also have a Tumblr that I don't think anyone knows about. So,
which I've seen that was linked on your website too. So if anyone wants to see that, that's there.
Yeah, it's over there. So everything's there. I also load things up on SoundCloud all the time. And I'm thinking about starting a Twitch channel, but I can't decide if I want to go through the trauma.
Well, let us know over here if you're gonna jump on that bandwagon, and we'll make sure to shout it out, point it out, and answer whatever questions that you have about the Twitch platform.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you very much again for taking the time and just having a great conversation with me.
It was really fun.
All right. Take care of yourself too, and hopefully you successfully work through all of this insanity that you're currently processing, as we all are.
Yeah, all the stories we're going to have when this is over. We'll make this through. History shows.
All right. Thank you so much for the great parting words.